Hello and welcome to the house party. This week we're excited to be with you once again. You may notice there's a little bit of discrepancy from the sound quality we've been having until tonight. We're having just a little bit of technical difficulties, but I believe we're going to make it through this tonight. So let's just get into the lesson. We talked about in our new series, Between the Past and the Promise. This week was part 3. And the title of the message was How to Reduce Your Stay in the Wilderness. And just some basic promises and principles I want to go over before we get to our questions for this evening. The road to every promised land passes through some kind of wilderness. And the wilderness is that between place that stands between you and your promise. There's a saying that goes like this: you've got to go through it to get to it. And that's kind of the way it is with the wilderness. So the main idea we talked about this week was how long we stay in the in-between place in the wilderness is directly proportional to how we respond while we're in it. And we looked at the children of Israel once again from Exodus chapters 15, 16, 17, and we watched them and studied how they went through their wilderness. And they had to go through the wilderness, remember, because God said you can't go the direct route, you've got to go the long way around. And so God's intention was for Israel to stay 2 years in the wilderness before being ready to enter into the promised land. But because of their fear, instead of faith, they didn't trust God. They heard the bad reports about the giants and the walled cities and so forth. They refused to go into the land that God said was theirs. And as a result of that, they extended their stay in the wilderness 40 years. God's intention was 2 years, but as it turned out, it lasted 40 years that they stayed in the wilderness. And that's because all the unbelief of that generation had to die off. And the only two people from the previous generation to enter into the promised land was Joshua and Caleb. Now, how long we stay in our in-between place is directly proportional to how we respond when we're going through it. The good news is this: it means that we don't have to remain in the wilderness any longer than God wants us there. We can learn something from Israel, the children of Israel, from their mistakes that they made, and avoid spending 40 years in the wilderness. We can get through it in 2 years, so to speak. So we talked about also in the previous week that the wilderness is all about revelation. It's about experiencing God. It's about learning about God. It's about knowing God and knowing ourselves. And so here are the questions I have for you this week, and I want you to discuss this in your group. First of all, what is one lesson that you have learned in your wilderness journey? Let's talk about one lesson that you've learned in your wilderness journey. Second question is this. So one of the principles we covered this week when we understood that the wilderness is always about testing. It's a time of testing. Your in-between place is a time of testing. So we made this statement: the wilderness is always about God testing you and not you testing God. Now, think about that. Maybe talk about it and answer this question: what does that mean to you in your life? Is what you're going through, are you testing God and saying, God, if you don't come through here, or I'm expecting you to come through here, and if you don't do it, I want to go back to Egypt, all that stuff? Or are you allowing God to go ahead and test you David the psalmist said, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, prove me, and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me." That is the reason that we're in the wilderness, is for God to examine us, for we to examine ourselves, for God to prove us. And that means, that word prove means to put to the test in order to approve. So God wants us, and He's able to help us to get through it and to prove ourselves. Here's the last question for you this week. At this moment in your life, as you consider your in-between place in your own personal life, what kind of response does God want from you? We talked about the length that we stay in the wilderness is directly proportional to our response. If we respond correctly, then we get through the wilderness a whole lot quicker. If we respond with rebellion, with criticism, with accusation, then we're going to take another trip around the mountain. But at this moment in your life, what kind of response do you feel that God wants from you? Listen, have a great time in your house party this week. We love you, and we'll see you next time. God bless.